Hello, and welcome back to One Idea Away. I'm Hayden, and I want to start today's episode with a statement from my research that might sound a little like deflating at first, but I think it's one of the more freeing ideas that I've covered so far on this podcast. You are not as in control of yourself as you think you are. Not your focus, not energy, not motivation, not quality of your thinking. A lot of what feels like a personal decision or like a reflection of your character, or your discipline, or how much you actually care about something is actually just an output of your biological systems in your body that are running underneath your conscious experience, whether you know about them and can control them or not. The person who has spent the most time, at least in his public research, making that case in an accessible way is Andrew Huberman. He's a neuroscientist and a professor at Stanford, where his lab studies how the brain changes in response to experience and how vision, in particular, connects to the nervous system. But most people know him from his podcast, the Huberman Lab, which has become, over time, one of the most listened to science shows in the world by doing something that sounds simple, but is actually like really hard connecting to this podcast. Taking research that lives in academic journals and then turning it into specific actionable things that people can actually do in their day-to-day lives. His central idea, the idea that I want to spend this entire episode on, it goes something like this. Willpower is real, but it's an unreliable and infinite resource. And if you're depending on willpower alone to focus or sleep well or stay motivated for a long period of time, you're essentially trying to row upstream with a tiny paddle. The more useful project is understanding that biological systems that govern all those things in the first place, and then designing your behavior around those systems instead of against them. Protocols, as Huberman calls them, instead of willpower. It kind of sounds like a clinical thing when you say it that way, but deeper down, it's more interesting than that, I think, because what Huberman is really arguing here is that the question most people are asking, how do I become more disciplined, is slightly the wrong question. The better question to ask here is how do I build an environment and a set of daily behaviors that make discipline less necessary, which connects to James Clear's whole framework from Atomic Habits, where he argues that you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Huberman is making an almost identical argument, but from a neuroscience angle rather than like a behavioral one. The biology is going to produce an output no matter what you do. The question is whether you've set it up to produce the output that you want. Before I get into specific mechanisms, I want to spend a little time on who Huberman actually is, because I think the context behind him matters for understanding why he approaches things the way he does. He grew up in California, got his PhD in neuroscience from UC Davis, and did doctoral work at Stanford, and has since been a professor there since 2016. His research lab focuses primarily on the visual system and neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and rewire itself in response to experience. The fact that the brain can change structurally based on what you do repeatedly is one of the most important discoveries in modern neuroscience, and it sits underneath a lot of what Huberman talks about, even when he's not discussing it directly, like saying the word neuroplasticity. He started the Huberman Lab podcast in 2021, and it grew crazy fast. And I thought about this a lot while researching this episode, because the speed of that growth itself is an interesting data point. There are a lot of health and wellness podcasts out there. Most of them do vague advice points or motivational content that doesn't really have a specific mechanism underneath it. What made Huberman's show different, at least early on in it, was that he would actually spend 2 or 3 hours on a single topic, going through all the actual biology about how something works, like citing specific studies, naming researchers who did research on it, and then he would connect all of that to practical recommendations. The depth in this was the big differentiator between other health and wellness podcasts, and people were apparently hungry for it in a way that surprised even him. Now, the obvious question, the one I genuinely sat with for a while before this episode, is whether everything he's saying is as solid as it sounds. And the honest answer to that is that it's complicated. Some of what Huberman discusses is extremely well established, like core neuroscience and physiology with deep research behind it. Some of it is more preliminary, like early studies or emerging evidence that's interesting and it shows promise, but isn't yet definitive. And some critics in the scientific community have pushed back on the idea that translating these research findings, these new things, into personal protocols is not always as clean and direct as the podcast could make it seem. Science, especially pertaining to complex biological systems in humans, rarely directly relates to the kind of clean, actionable takeaway that a podcast format naturally biases towards. I think that's a fair and important criticism to keep in mind, but I also don't think it fully encapsulates what Huberman is doing, because the most foundational ideas he keeps returning to are not controversial at all. And those foundational ideas are what I want to spend most of our time on today. The first one, this one actually changed how I thought about my own days when I first came across it, is about light, specifically about morning light. Huberman talks about getting outside within the first hour of waking up and exposing your eyes to natural sunlight for somewhere between 5 and 30 minutes, depending on how bright the day is and where you are. It's not just about vitamin D, although that matters too. It's about something more specific. Your brain has a master clock within it. It sits in a region of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a name I kind of like purely because it sounds something like a crazy thing from a science fiction novel. This master clock governs an enormous amount of what happens within your body over a 24-hour period, including when you feel alert, when your cortisol peaks and drops, when your body temperature rises and falls, and eventually when your brain starts releasing melatonin to prepare you for sleep. The whole thing is called your circadian rhythm, which most people have heard of at a surface level, but most people don't realize that this clock has to be set every single day. It's not automatically synchronized. It takes its primary calibration from light signals, specifically from light hitting a specific set of photoreceptors in your eyes that are most sensitive to the blue-yellow contrast of natural sunlight in the morning sky. When you get that light signal early in the day, it triggers a healthy cortisol pulse, which sounds alarming because we usually hear cortisol talked about in the context of stress, but a properly timed morning cortisol spike is actually a good thing. It wakes up your immune system, it sharpens your alertness, and it sets a timer that will, roughly 12 to 16 hours later, trigger a release of melatonin, which will help you fall asleep. The morning light basically programs when you'll feel tired at night. What Huberman is saying here is that a huge amount of people are operating with a miscalibrated biological clock without knowing it, because they wake up, stay inside under artificial lighting, which is way dimmer than natural sunlight, even on a cloudy day. They stare at their phone, they'll drink coffee to override the signals their body is sending, and then they wonder why they can't fall asleep at a reasonable hour and they feel tired and off the next morning. The clock never got properly set. Everything downstream of that is a little off, and no amount of willpower can fix a miscalibrated circadian system. Once I understood that mechanism, the morning sunlight recommendations stopped sounding just like some wellness buzz advice, and it started sounding like basic system maintenance, which is exactly the reframe that Huberman is going for here. Sleep is the area where I think Huberman's finding is the most powerful, and also where it connects most directly to everything else he talks about. He said in several different ways that sleep is probably the most important factor in cognitive performance, emotional regulation, physical health, and the long-term effectiveness of almost anything else you're trying to do. Not the most exciting or dramatic factor, just the most foundational one. And this isn't really a controversial claim in the research community. The data on sleep deprivation and its effects on basically every measurable cognitive metric are pretty overwhelming. What Huberman adds to what people generally already know about sleep being important is the mechanistic detail. When you sleep, your brain does something that's almost too good to be true when you first hear it. It shrinks slightly, allowing the cerebrospinal fluid to flow through and flush out metabolic waste products that accumulated during your day, including proteins associated with neurodegenerative diseases. This system is called the glymphatic system, and it mostly operates during deep sleep. You're literally cleaning out your brain overnight. And if you chronically cut that process short, the buildup happens faster than the cleanup. Sleep is also when memories actually get consolidated into your long-term storage. What you learn during the day and gets moved from the short-term fragile storage into the longer-term structures during sleep, particularly during your REM stages. The phrase sleep on it is actually very neurologically accurate. Your brain isn't like offline when you sleep. It's doing some of the most important work it does all day. And when you understand that concept, treating sleep as something to minimize or optimize around, which is surprisingly common in ambitious, high-achieving environments, is a lot less like discipline and more like eating the seed corn. The third major piece of Huberman's framework, and the one that I find the most conceptually interesting, is how he talks about dopamine. Most people have heard that dopamine is the quote-unquote feel-good chemical, and the thing that gets released when something pleasurable happens. But that's a incomplete picture of what dopamine does, and Huberman spends a lot of time in his podcast trying to correct that. Dopamine isn't primarily a reward signal. It's primarily a motivation and anticipation signal. It's the thing that makes you want to pursue something, not just the thing that makes you feel good when you get it. When you're excited about a goal, or you feel that pull towards starting a project, or experience some sense of drive and a forward momentum, that's dopamine at work. When dopamine is low, things feel effortful and pointless, even when things should be intrinsically interesting. The world just doesn't call to you in the same way, which is why dopamine depletion is central to depression, and why people sometimes describe depression not as sadness, but as a strange flatness where nothing's worth pursuing. Here's the thing that I kept thinking about after I heard Huberman first explain dopamine. Dopamine operates on two levels simultaneously. There's a peak level, which is what you experience during something exciting or pleasurable, and there's a baseline level, which is your general background level of motivation and drive. And these two things are in a constant relationship with each other. Every time you experience a significant peak, your baseline drops a little afterward. Your brain is constantly trying to return to a constant average equilibrium of dopamine, which means that if you're regularly chasing very intense experiences or rewards, whether that's social media, substances, extreme stimulation of any kind, you're repeatedly spiking and dropping, and your baseline level of motivation over time can actually get lower, not higher. You need more stimulation just to feel normal, and less intense things, including actual meaningful work, stop feeling interesting in comparison. This is Huberman's explanation for why, for instance, someone can spend 20 minutes scrolling through a phone and then sit down to work on something that they claim to care about and feel completely unable to focus. It's not a failing of morals. It's not a character problem. The dopamine baseline just dropped. The work, which produces a slower, less intense reward signal than the constant novelty of a feed, can't compete with what the nervous system just got used to. The practical implication here is almost the opposite of what productivity advice tells you to. Instead of trying to make work more exciting or rewarding in the moment, which is the logic behind a lot of gamification and reward systems, Huberman's framework suggests that the more important lever is managing what you do before the work. Limiting high stimulation activities earlier in the day, not reaching for your phone the first thing in the morning, protecting the baseline rather than trying to spike your way into focus. The focus is downstream of what you've already done to your dopamine system. This connects really directly to something we talked about with Seneca, actually. Seneca was suspicious of desire that expanded faster than it could be satisfied, the kind of wanting that never resolves into feeling like enough. He was describing from a philosophical angle something that neuroscience has now given us a mechanistic account of. When Seneca talked about people who were always wanting something else, always restless, always sure that the next thing will finally satisfy them, he was essentially describing a chronically disruptive reward system. He didn't have the word dopamine, but he had millennia of observational evidence that something in human psychology pulls this way, and that understanding it is the beginning of managing it. The protocol over willpower idea also connects very directly to Dalio's whole approach to decision-making. Dalio built systems, formal structures at Bridgewater because he understood that relying on any individual person's judgment and willpower in the moment was unreliable. The environment and the process had to be designed to produce good outcomes even when the individual was tired or biased or, I don't know. Huberman is essentially making the same argument about personal performance. Don't trust yourself to make the right choice about going to sleep on time when you're already sitting in front of something engaging at midnight. Design the environment earlier in the day so that the choice becomes easier or less necessary when the hard moment arrives. And honestly, it connects to Chouinard too in an unexpected way. One of the things that made Patagonia unusual was the idea that the design of the environment, the culture Chouinard built, did the work that most companies try to do through top-down pressure and rules. Employees surfed when the waves were good because the system trusted them to get the work done. The environment was designed to support a certain kind of life rather than relying on individual willpower to manufacture that life against an environment that was pulling in a different direction. Huberman is making a parallel argument on the level of individual biology. You can fight your circadian rhythm with caffeine and force a will, or you can set your circadian rhythm up correctly in the morning so you don't have to fight it later. I also want to spend a minute on something that I think gets underappreciated when people talk about Huberman, which is the democratization piece. A lot of the information he's putting out there existed before he started to podcast it. It was in academic journals, in textbooks, in the work of sleep researchers like Matthew Walker or chronobiologists studying circadian rhythms. But it was sitting behind a wall of technical language and institutional access that most people couldn't get through. Huberman's project has been to take that wall down, or at least to lower it significantly. And I think this matters a lot more than it might seem like it does at first. Health and performance advice has historically been distributed pretty unequally. The people who had access to high-quality information about sleep, nutrition, light exposure, stress physiology, and how these things actually work in the body were the people who could afford expensive trainers or coaches or doctors who stayed current with research. Everyone else got told to eat less, move more, get some sleep, manage your stress, which is technically accurate, but almost completely useless as guidance because it doesn't include any of the how. Huberman's podcast reaches people who could have never otherwise encountered this information, and that matters. Though, it's worth being honest about the limits here too, because I kept bumping into them while researching. Not every protocol Huberman recommends works equally well for everyone. Individual biology varies a lot, and the research base behind some specific recommendations is significantly thinner than the research base behind the core principles. There's also something worth questioning in the overall frame, which is whether life fully optimized for biological performance is necessarily the best or most meaningful life. Seneca would definitely have something to say about a person who becomes so focused on managing their cortisol and their dopamine systems that they lose the capacity to just be present with an experience that doesn't fit into their protocol. Marcus Aurelius, who spent a lot of time thinking about what's actually within our control, might push back on the assumption that we should spend this much effort trying to control these outcomes that are only partially controllable to begin with. And those are all their concerns. And I don't think that Huberman would necessarily disagree with them. He's been pretty clear that his protocols are tools, not commandments, and that his goal is to make your biology work for you rather than to become a slave to a new, more scientifically accurate set of rules. The question worth sitting with is whether the way a lot of people engage with this information, the kind of optimization mindset that sometimes grows up around it, honors that distinction. But I think the core insight survives these complications. Your nervous system is producing your experience of the world, the quality of your attention, your motivation, your resilience, your sleep, your mood across a given day. And those aren't purely products of your character or your choices. They're produced by physical systems that have specific inputs and specific outputs. And understanding those systems, even perfectly, even incompletely, is better than not understanding them. The reason this feels important to me, the reason I wanted to spend an entire episode on it, is that huge amount of suffering, I think, comes from people blaming themselves for things that are significantly biological. The person who can't wake up early and hates themselves for it, never having adjusted their light exposure or their sleep timing in a way that would genuinely shift their chronotype. The person who can't seem to stay motivated on a project that they genuinely care about, who calls himself lazy, never having understood that their dopamine baseline had been chronically depleted by the way that they were using their phone. This connects back to something that Dalio said about the importance of seeing yourself accurately, not being too hard on yourself, not being too easy on yourself, but understanding the mechanisms at play. You can't improve a system you don't understand, and you can't be fair to yourself about your own performance if you're blaming your character for the outcomes that were largely determined by biology. There's also something in Huberman's whole project that echoes what Grove was doing at a different level. Grove wanted to build organizations that could see change coming before it became a crisis. He was trying to make information flow better, to catch signals earlier, to make an accurate perception of reality more available to the people who needed it. Huberman is trying to do something similar at the level of individual human beings. He wants people to have an accurate model of how their own nervous system works so they can catch the signals their biology is sending and respond to them thoughtfully rather than just being pushed around by forces they can't even see. The idea that your 3 p.m. focus crash isn't a personal failing, but a predictable biological event tied to your core body temperature cycle, or that your difficulty sleeping isn't a character flaw, but a consequence of blue light suppressing your melatonin production in the evening, or that your inability to feel excited about something genuinely interesting is potentially a sign of depleted dopamine system rather than evidence that you don't actually care about your work. These reframes are useful. They give you a place to intervene that isn't just someone telling you to try harder. And underneath all of the specific protocols that might be the actual one idea, not any particular recommendation about light or sleep or cold exposure, not the specific timing of caffeine intake or the optimal structure of a workout. The actual idea is that you are a biological system operating inside an environment, and the match between your behaviors and your biology matters enormously. When that match is good, things that should be hard feel a lot more manageable. When the match is bad, things that should be easy feel like pushing against something invisible. Most people go their entire lives without understanding what's producing that difference. They just assume it's about who they are. Huberman's argument is that it doesn't have to be that mysterious. A lot of the governing variables of these mysterious outputs are actually knowable, and once you know them, you have a lot more agency over your experience than what you might have assumed in the past. The morning sunlight is free. Protecting the first part of your day before your dopamine system gets hijacked by your phone doesn't cost anything. Going to sleep and waking up at consistent times is available to almost anyone. These aren't expensive interventions or complicated biohacks. They're just behaviors aligned with the biology you've been running your entire life, whether you knew it or not. And that alignment, when you actually achieve it, produces something that willpower by itself cannot. Like a kind of ease, not an absence of effort, but effort that moves in the same direction as your biology rather than against it. The difference between rowing with the current and rowing against it, it's the same paddle, the same willpower. It's a completely different experience, though. The question that Huberman would probably leave you with really isn't about any specific protocol. It's closer to more, which parts of your life are you making harder than they need to be because you're fighting your biology instead of working with it? And I think that's the question I want to leave this with. Thanks for listening.